Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our course. This is Legal and Ethical Issues. I'm delighted to be your instructor. My name is Dr. Gabe Telleria, and I hope that you will find this course really enlightening, interesting, and also that you can learn a few things and apply them to your personal and professional lives. So, welcome again. I'm very happy to be your instructor once again. So let's get started on this first week of our assignments and touch upon some of these really interesting and often confusing topics that we will discuss in this class on ethics. All right, so first let's go over some of the assignments and the requirements for this first week. You have for this week you have chapter 1 and chapter 2 as your required readings. You have chapter 1, introduction and pop quiz. Focus on your job in public administration or one you would like to have one day. Does your profession have a code of ethics? So for example, if you're a medical doctor or if you are an engineer who might have to sign off on a bridge, for example. So does your profession have a code of ethics, right? Chapter 2, it deals with administrative ethics, these ideas, sources, and development. Here we talk about Kantian ethics, I should say, deontological ethics, or deontology, which is ethics based on a sense of duty. Then you have also chapter 2 covers virtue ethics, consequentialism, principle and consequences, and then ethics, morality, and the law. Then your videos, which are really, really good this first week, these cover 3 different topics. The first one is meta-ethics, and we'll talk a little bit about meta-ethics here very briefly. We'll also talk about divine command theory, which is the other video that you have. And then the third one is on natural law, and that's St. Thomas Aquinas. So these are 3 videos that you have this week, which, as I said, I hope you really enjoy. I hope they're a little long, longer than your usual 5-minute videos, but they are very much worth it. And the narrator does a really nice job narrating through some of these often dense topics and subjects. So let's talk about one of these subjects, and that is meta-ethics. All right. So, by the way, don't be concerned right at the get-go if all of these words start kind of meaning the same thing and they are confusing, because ethics is really confusing. But we'll try and make sense of it as we go along in the class. And you're not going to be an expert in ethics, because again, it's a really, really extensive area of study and discipline. But at least we'll learn a few things that we can apply to our current modern day lives, whether it's personal and also in our jobs, right, professionally. So, meta-ethics. All right, is there such thing as a good lie? Right. Think about these questions. Is there such a thing as a good lie? Is lying justified in any time? Does the end justify the means? Right? Do consequences determine if an action is ethical or not? So these are some pretty deep questions that we ask ourselves, right? And let's see if we can try and answer them in some way here in these next couple of slides. So first we have a concept called moral realism. And moral realism is this idea of, or this question of whether there are moral facts, right? Is there anything that we know for a fact to be 100% true, right? And what's important about moral realism is that it leads us to what we often refer to as the grounding problem of ethics. And this has to do with whether we believe that ethics are absolute or relative. And if they are relative, what are some of those drivers that make ethics relative? For example, if we believe that morality is absolute, then things are moral or not, or whether things are moral or not, does not depend on time or place, meaning that an action or a thing is moral regardless of the time, the place, the context. It doesn't matter. This is moral absolutism. On the other hand, you have moral relativism. And moral relativism says that things are right or wrong depending on the time, the place, the context. You can think about some of the arguments that come about when we think about moral relativism. If you think about history, right, and some of the actions of the past, which we now know to be immoral. And yet, those actions at some point in our history were considered moral, right? For those of us that are public servants and work in government, we know that the way that government works today and the rights and the protections of government for citizens today is not the same, or was not the same 100 years ago, or 120 or 130 years ago, right? And so we see how government has adapted and adopted new morality, a different morality to some extent, where government in some sense was moral, relatively moral, not absolute moral, because it believed that certain actions and certain things and certain legislation, for example, was moral in some time in our history, which we now know to not be moral, and we have changed it because of that changing understanding about morality. And then there's cultural relativism, which makes certain morality makes it acceptable in certain cultural settings, in certain cultures, but not others. Okay, so think about that in your own cultural perspective, and think if you can maybe think about one thing that in your culture is considered perfectly acceptable and normal, and it may not necessarily be in other cultures, right? And then, of course, we have divine command theory. And divine command theory is an interesting concept because, especially for us who are Christians, because it's the idea that morality originates with God. And this is, of course, the Judeo-Christian tradition. And here, we solve the grounding problem to some extent, I write here, because we solve it if we are Christians, if we have a Judeo-Christian tradition, and we believe that everything comes from God, and God is omnipotent and all-knowing, and there was no the Omega, the Alpha, the Omega, right? So we believe in these things, and so it solves this grounding problem because everything comes from God, right? He is the source of everything. But what if you're not Christian? What if you don't believe in God? What if you're an atheist? And so it doesn't solve it completely for everybody on earth, right? And there's also yet another dilemma that comes about from even for those of us who are Christians and who believe in a higher power, right? In God the Father. It's the let's see if I can pronounce it. The Euthyphro problem. Okay, and this is a dilemma, and the dilemma is whether actions are right because God commands them, or are right actions commanded by God because they are right. Now you start thinking about this dilemma. Think about justifying war. And even justifying anything that happens, right? You know, we often say things happen because God intended for them to happen that way. So think about that. If something does happen and it's God's will, is that right? right? Even though the consequences of such an act might not be something that we necessarily like at the end. But are those actions right? Or are right actions right because God commands them? So if something happens, was that the right action because it's commanded by God? So it can get a little bit confusing, right? As to and especially when we start thinking about the Word of God, the Bible, right? And we read the Bible and we understand the Bible and we follow God's Word and we seek to be like Christ. So does that mean that everything in the Bible should be taken literally, right? And we see in the video where there are some examples of certain things in the Bible that somehow don't quite make 100%. They're not the case 100% of the time, right? Like some of these requirements or these prohibitions that we find in the Bible, should we take them literally, right? And where you cannot wear certain clothing, right? Certain fibers. What is the meaning behind them? Because we need to also understand what's meant in the Word, and we need to be able to understand it, need to be able to interpret it in the right way, right? But so meaning and value judgment, right? Which of the what parts are more important than others? This is not an easy question to answer, right? And so it does create a little bit of a dilemma for us Christians to be able to understand morality in the biblical sense, because of the fact that we have to interpret a lot of what we read in the Bible, right? Okay, now in this class we're going to be studying several theories in ethics. Among them, and we'll study these in later chapters. This is chapter 2, and then other chapters. But just to very briefly, utilitarianism, which some of you might have heard at some point in your lives, and that is the idea that the ends justify the means. It's based on the utility, Jeremy Bentham, the idea that we seek pleasure and we don't like pain. So anything that gives us pleasure, we should seek, and it is justified. But of course, we begin very quickly to see how that can take us down the wrong path, right? So utilitarianism. Then we have consequentialism, which is the idea that consequences dictate whether action is right or wrong. Now we can see here, right, that it kind of puts us in a dilemma in and of itself, in that if we say, well, you know what, the consequences were the right ones. So at the end, it turned out to be a good thing, even though we didn't intend for it to be a good thing. Kind of like the example that the video gives us about the burglar, right, who comes in, breaks the window, and his actions were his desire was to steal, to break in and rob the old lady. Instead, he unintendedly saved her because he broke the window, let out the poisonous gas. The elderly lady was able to regain her consciousness, and his consequences were positive. So does that mean that the action of stealing was correct? And the answer, of course, depends on which of the lenses you are looking at this action through. This also is known as the Robin Hood effect also. And it's a Robin Hood dilemma, right? Should you steal from the rich to give to the poor? Is it justified that you steal bread so that you can give it to a child that is hungry, right? After all, the consequences are positive, right? And so that also raises dilemmas. And then you have deontology, which is also known as Kantian ethics, and that's the idea that morality is based on a sense of duty, deos, okay? And so deos is duty means duty. And what that means is that morality is irrespective of what the consequences are and what ends up happening. If the action, if the spirit of the action was not right or immoral, then the action is immoral in and of itself. Okay, so just a couple of reminders here about your assignments for this week. You have a multimedia discussion board. This is due Saturday. Okay, so please remember that this PowerPoint presentation has to have a minimum of 3 slides. So you have a title slide, a content slide, and a closing slide. Okay, so make sure that you don't forget about that. We also have for this week step 2, you create the narrated presentation. Make sure that you narrate it, right? So you don't have to show your face if you don't want, but it would be nice to be able to see you at least in a little corner. But certainly narrow the presentation. Make sure that it's graphic heavy, okay? Little or no text. And try and speak naturally, right? With a fun tone, right? This is intended to be fun and engaging, right? So try and have fun with it, all right? Your presentation should be hosted you can host it in YouTube, for example, or Vimeo. I use YouTube for my presentations. I record them on Prezi, and then I upload them to YouTube, and then I share them and embed them into the Blackboard Cal Baptist website. So that's how I do mine. Okay. Make sure that you respond by Sunday night. Okay, at least 2 of your colleagues. Right? This is also part of the grade, so make sure that you do that. And what else? That's it. I'm looking forward to seeing your responses and to reading and listening to your presentations. You can also, if you wish, you can also use other recording options. For example, Animaker or Prezi, which I use. VoiceThread. So I'll leave you with these links in case these are more familiar or you prefer them. Okay. All right. And then last but not least, I wish you all a wonderful week. I hope you have enjoyed this brief presentation for week 1. And thank you very much, and God bless you. Take care. Bye-bye.